In the quiet suburban town of Riverton, there lived a man who seemed to have it all, a picture-perfect life that everyone admired. Pastor Jonathan Edwards was a well-respected figure in the community, a man of faith. With a powerful presence in his pulpit, Jonathan was known for his deep sermons that inspired his congregation and earned him the respect of both religious and social circles. His church, St. Matthew's, was thriving, with families flocking to hear his messages of hope, redemption, and love. His wife, Charlotte Edwards, a graceful and dedicated woman, was the perfect complement to him. By his side through thick and thin, a loving mother to their 2 teenage children, and a supportive partner to her husband in all his endeavors. From the outside, they were the epitome of the American dream. Jonathan's dark brown eyes, sharp jawline, and commanding stature made him an imposing figure. Yet, it was his personality that drew people in, charismatic, confident, and always in control. Charlotte, with her auburn hair and gentle hazel eyes, was the calm in the storm, the anchor to Jonathan's larger-than-life persona. Together, they were the ideal power couple, an image that others aspired to emulate. Their life was a model of success, a spacious home in a gated community, a thriving church ministry, and a well-respected position in local charities. Jonathan had built his reputation on the foundation of his faith and the trust people had in him. Charlotte stood by him, always supportive, always there, never questioning the man she thought she knew. But behind closed doors, Jonathan was keeping a dark secret, a secret that would not only shatter his carefully crafted life, but also destroy the woman who had been his biggest supporter. For years, Charlotte had been blissfully unaware of the lies Jonathan was living. As a pastor, Jonathan was supposed to embody the values of truth, honesty, and loyalty. He preached about love, compassion, and the sanctity of marriage. But beneath the surface, a different reality played out. Jonathan was leading a double life, one that was built on deception, secrecy, and betrayal. For months, Charlotte had noticed subtle changes in Jonathan's behavior. He had become distant, spending long hours at the church or meeting with community leaders. His late-night phone calls, often followed by an uncomfortable silence when she entered the room, were starting to raise suspicions. But Jonathan was always quick with an explanation, reassuring Charlotte that he was simply busy with church affairs, organizing charity events, or counseling members of the congregation. But Charlotte's intuition began to tell her otherwise. It wasn't just the late nights or the increasingly frequent business trips that raised alarms. It was the way Jonathan was acting around her. He seemed colder, more impatient, and there was a tension in their once warm marriage that she couldn't ignore. Charlotte dismissed her thoughts, convincing herself that it was just the stress of Jonathan's high-pressure position taking a toll on him. She didn't want to believe that the man she had built her life around, the man she had trusted implicitly, was hiding something so dark. Then, one evening, everything changed. Charlotte was at home alone when she received a call that would turn her life upside down. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "Mrs. Edwards," the voice said, "you need to know what your husband is really doing when he's not at home." At first, Charlotte thought it was a prank call, but the caller, a woman, went on to explain details about Jonathan's secret life that no one else could possibly know. The woman described intimate encounters with Jonathan, encounters that involved not just one man, but several. He wasn't just having affairs. He was engaging in relationships with men from within the church community, using his position of power and trust to manipulate and exploit them. Charlotte's heart raced as she listened, her mind struggling to process the words. She hung up the phone in disbelief, her thoughts a whirlwind of shock and confusion. She had been married to Jonathan for over 15 years. They had built a life together. They had raised children together. And yet, here she was, hearing the darkest truth about the man she had always considered her partner. The following days were a blur of tension and emotional turmoil. Charlotte confronted Jonathan, but he vehemently denied everything. He reassured her that someone was trying to ruin his reputation, that it was all lies, baseless accusations from someone with an agenda. Jonathan's charm was in full force as he manipulated the situation, making Charlotte feel guilty for even questioning him. But the seed of doubt had already been planted in her mind. Charlotte decided to investigate further, but what she uncovered was far worse than she could have imagined. She found messages, explicit, secretive exchanges. On Jonathan's phone, emails filled with confessions of passion and manipulation, and photographs that showed Jonathan in compromising situations with other men. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Charlotte realized the full extent of Jonathan's betrayal. Not only had he been unfaithful to her, but he had been deceiving everyone around him, his congregation, his colleagues, and even his own children. It was in this moment of raw discovery that Charlotte knew the truth. Jonathan had been living a lie, and he had been using his position of power to manipulate those who trusted him. But what was she supposed to do now? The man she had built her life around, the man she had loved, was a fraud. He wasn't just unfaithful. He was dangerous, obsessed with control, and willing to destroy anyone who threatened his carefully curated image. Charlotte's world began to unravel. She was no longer just the supportive wife. She was the woman betrayed by the very man she had devoted her life to. But she couldn't keep silent. The truth had to come out. As Charlotte prepared to confront Jonathan with the evidence of his deceit, little did she know that this would be the beginning of a series of events that would spiral out of control, leading to a crime that no one could have foreseen. The cracks in Jonathan's facade were beginning to show, and Charlotte was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. The weeks following Charlotte's discovery were a blur of tension, confusion, and dread. She had always believed that the greatest threat to her family would come from the outside world, perhaps a financial crisis or a tragedy that struck from the unexpected. But now, her greatest fear had come from the very man she had trusted most, her husband, Jonathan. The man she had spent the last 15 years of her life with, the man who had stood at the altar beside her, promising love and faithfulness, had turned out to be the architect of his own double life. Charlotte was no longer sure what to do. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger, betrayal, shame, and, most of all, confusion. The revelations about Jonathan's affairs had shattered everything she thought she knew about their relationship. But it wasn't just the affairs that haunted her. It was the realization that Jonathan had used his position as a pastor, a man of faith and moral authority, to manipulate and control others, to conceal his darkest desires under the guise of religious devotion. The days following Charlotte's confrontation with Jonathan were filled with heated arguments, accusations, and a chilling sense of unease. Jonathan had become a master of manipulation, and Charlotte quickly learned that no matter what evidence she presented, he would deny it all. His charm and charisma, the same qualities that had drawn people to him for years, were now being used against her. He would soothe her fears, convince her that it was all just a misunderstanding, and assure her that he was committed to their marriage. Yet, the more Jonathan spoke, the more Charlotte could see through the mask he had carefully constructed. He was lying, and the truth was slipping further from his grasp. But Charlotte could not let the matter rest. She had evidence: text messages, emails, photographs, and it was enough to expose Jonathan for who he really was. She knew that confronting him again would bring the storm she dreaded, but she also knew she couldn't go on living a lie. The church, the community, and most importantly, their children deserved to know the truth about the man they had all placed their trust in. It was during one of their late-night confrontations that Jonathan made a chilling admission. Sitting across from Charlotte in their study, his once confident demeanor now tinged with panic, he finally spoke the words that confirmed the depth of his depravity. "Charlotte, you don't understand," Jonathan said, his voice eerily calm, yet strained with underlying fear. "I didn't want this. I never wanted any of it. But you have to realize something. This is who I am, and no one can know the truth. No one. Do you understand?" Charlotte stared at him, her mind reeling. The man who had always preached about forgiveness, redemption, and truth was now revealing the very heart of his corruption. It was a moment of stark honesty, a fleeting admission of guilt, and yet, in his eyes, there was no remorse. There was only fear, fear of exposure, fear of losing everything he had worked so hard to build. "You can't tell anyone," he continued, his voice now low and threatening. "If you do, you'll ruin everything. You'll destroy the family. You'll destroy me. I've worked too hard for this life. I've built everything from the ground up, and I won't let you tear it all down." The words sent a cold chill down Charlotte's spine. She had seen Jonathan's controlling nature before, but never in such an open display. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about power. Jonathan wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was willing to destroy anyone who threatened his control, including the woman he had promised to love and cherish. In his eyes, the family, his church, and everything he had worked for were nothing more than pawns in a game he had been playing for far too long. Charlotte had always known that Jonathan's ambition ran deep, but she had never seen this side of him. His obsession with power, control, and perfection was all-consuming, and now it was clear that he would stop at nothing to preserve the image he had so carefully cultivated. She had become a liability, a threat to his empire, and she knew that, in his mind, there was only one way to keep her silent. As the days passed, Charlotte grew more desperate. She knew she had to act fast. She couldn't allow Jonathan to continue manipulating and destroying the lives of others. She couldn't remain silent while he destroyed their marriage, their family, and the lives of countless others. But as she prepared to expose him, the weight of her decision grew heavier. Jonathan's influence was vast. He wasn't just a pastor. He was a leader, a pillar of the community. If she exposed him, the fallout would be devastating. Their children would suffer, their reputations would be destroyed, and the church, a place that had been a refuge for so many, would crumble. But Charlotte knew there was no other choice. The truth had to come out. People had to know who Jonathan really was, what he was capable of. It was at that moment, as she steeled herself for the fight ahead, that Jonathan took matters into his own hands. Charlotte had been planning to leave, to take their children and flee the suffocating grip of his control. But Jonathan had a plan of his own, one that would change everything. Late one night, after a heated argument in their home, Charlotte discovered that Jonathan had taken a drastic step to ensure that his secrets remained hidden forever. She had just returned from meeting with a lawyer, her mind swirling with thoughts of how she could leave Jonathan without risking her children's future. But when she walked into their bedroom that night, she found Jonathan standing there, his back to her, staring out the window. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken threat. "Jonathan," Charlotte said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you planning to do?" Jonathan turned slowly, his eyes dark and cold. "You don't understand, Charlotte. You've given me no choice." Before she could react, Jonathan lunged at her, grabbing her with force. He was no longer the man she had married, the man she had once loved. He was someone else entirely, someone capable of unspeakable acts to protect his secrets. Charlotte struggled against his grip, but it was no use. Jonathan was stronger, more determined than ever to keep his life, his power, intact. The events that followed were a blur of terror and helplessness. Charlotte fought back with everything she had, but in that moment, she knew deep down that Jonathan would do whatever it took to silence her, to make sure that his perfect life was never exposed. In that violent, chaotic moment, Charlotte was no longer just a woman betrayed. She had become a threat to Jonathan's empire, and in his mind, threats had to be eliminated. The night Charlotte Edwards realized the depths of her husband's malevolence would be the moment that defined everything to come. In that chaotic struggle, Jonathan's true nature finally surfaced. No longer the calm, confident pastor of St. Matthew's, he was revealed as a man willing to do anything to protect his carefully constructed facade. Charlotte's body trembled from the encounter, but her mind was locked in a cold, calculating state. Jonathan had crossed a line, one from which there was no return. That night, Charlotte didn't call the police. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she did what she had to do to survive. She ran. She fled the house, the man she had married, the life she thought she knew, and went to a safe house. For the first time in years, Charlotte was free from Jonathan's control. But the safety was short-lived. The silence that followed was suffocating, and the weight of what had transpired settled over her like a thick, unshakable fog. In the days following, Charlotte couldn't escape the haunting reality of what had just happened. Jonathan had assaulted her, and yet the worst part wasn't the violence. It was the realization that Jonathan was not just dangerous to her, but to everyone around him. The community adored him, trusted him, and believed in him. They saw him as a man of God, a moral leader. They didn't see the monster lurking behind his perfect smile, the obsession with control that had turned him into something monstrous. Charlotte's thoughts were consumed by one question. What would Jonathan do now that she had left him? What lengths would he go to ensure that no one uncovered the truth? The tension in her chest tightened as she replayed their final moments together, Jonathan's chilling words echoing in her ears. "You'll destroy everything if you expose me. No one can know the truth." The threat was clear. Jonathan would do anything to protect his reputation. He had already shown what he was capable of when he had assaulted her in their home. He would stop at nothing to silence her, and perhaps even worse, silence anyone who threatened to expose him. Charlotte knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She couldn't live in fear, constantly wondering if Jonathan was waiting in the shadows, plotting his next move. She knew that if she was going to survive, she had to be strong, and she had to fight back. She couldn't just be a passive victim. She had to expose Jonathan for who he truly was before he could destroy anyone else's life the way he had destroyed hers. But Charlotte wasn't the only one who knew the truth. Detective Lisa Harris, the investigator assigned to the case, had been tracking Jonathan's every move ever since Charlotte came forward with her allegations. Lisa had become suspicious of Jonathan long before Charlotte had approached her. There had been whispers, rumors from people in the community, accusations about Jonathan's inappropriate relationships with men, particularly vulnerable young men from his congregation. But no one had ever come forward with definitive proof, and Jonathan had always managed to stay one step ahead. When Charlotte had revealed the damning evidence of Jonathan's affairs, his manipulations, and the control he wielded over his victims, Detective Harris knew the case was no longer just a matter of infidelity or a broken marriage. It was about power, manipulation, and potentially even murder. Lisa was a seasoned investigator, and something about Jonathan's carefully crafted image made her wary. She was certain that there was more to this case than met the eye. Jonathan's perfect life, his control over the church and his community, was unraveling, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Charlotte, despite the fear that clung to her, decided that she would not be silenced. She returned to her home to gather the rest of the evidence that could bring Jonathan to justice. As she entered the house, the place that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. She walked through the rooms, feeling a sense of dread weigh heavily on her chest. But it wasn't just the house that made her uneasy. It was Jonathan's presence, even in his absence. It loomed over her like a shadow, waiting for her to make a wrong move, to slip up. Charlotte wasn't alone. Detective Harris had promised to help her, and she had brought with her the full weight of the law. They found Jonathan's journals, his meticulous accounts of each affair, each manipulation, and each person he had exploited. His words were chilling. He had kept detailed records of his conquests, both emotional and physical. Jonathan hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been systematically breaking down the lives of those he encountered, using his influence to control them. The more Charlotte read, the more she realized how deeply Jonathan had buried his darkness beneath the surface of his public persona. But as Charlotte and Detective Harris pieced together the full extent of Jonathan's actions, they began to uncover something even more sinister. Jonathan hadn't just been manipulating people for years. He had been involved in the disappearances of several young men from his congregation. These men had come to him for counseling, for guidance, only to find themselves trapped in a dangerous game of power and obsession. They were no longer just lost souls searching for salvation. They were victims of a man who had used them to feed his insatiable need for control. Charlotte could no longer ignore the truth. Jonathan wasn't just a man who had betrayed her. He was a predator. And the worst part was, he had hidden his true nature from everyone for years. He had used his position as a man of faith to manipulate and deceive people, leading them to believe he was someone he was not. The church, the community, had all been complicit in his facade. But now, as the evidence mounted against Jonathan, Charlotte realized the true scale of his crimes. There was no turning back. She had to expose him for the monster he was, no matter what the cost. The truth had to come out. Jonathan wasn't just a man who had strayed from his marriage. He was a man who had systematically destroyed the lives of those who had trusted him, using his power to silence anyone who dared to stand in his way. And now, it was time for his reign of terror to end. But even as Charlotte and Detective Harris prepared to confront Jonathan, they knew the danger wasn't over. Jonathan was a man who would stop at nothing to protect himself. As Charlotte and Lisa dug deeper into the evidence, they began to realize just how far Jonathan was willing to go to keep his secrets buried. The fight for justice had only just begun, and Charlotte knew that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Charlotte had spent weeks in fear, fighting the urge to stay hidden, to keep the secrets buried alongside the man who had betrayed her. But now, with Detective Lisa Harris by her side, she was prepared to face the truth head-on. Jonathan Edwards had been living a double life for years, and no longer could his carefully constructed image of the perfect pastor, the devoted husband, and the community leader remain intact. Charlotte's heart pounded as she and Detective Harris stood outside Jonathan's grand church office. The large wooden doors loomed before them like a symbol of the many secrets the building had held, secrets that were now coming to light. The stained glass windows shimmered in the afternoon sun, casting colorful hues on the pavement below. But the beauty of the church, the sanctuary that had once been a place of comfort, now felt hollow. The place was a facade, just like Jonathan. For so long, Charlotte had stood beside Jonathan, supporting him in his work, trusting in him. She had believed in the message he preached to his congregation, believed in the image of the perfect, moral man. But now, the truth could no longer be ignored. As Charlotte and Detective Harris entered the church office, a chill ran down Charlotte's spine. The quiet of the building seemed oppressive, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Jonathan was sitting behind his massive desk, flipping through papers as if everything were normal. When he saw Charlotte and Lisa enter, he straightened up, his eyes narrowing slightly. The charm that had once made him so convincing was still there, but now it was tinged with a cold, calculating edge. "Charlotte," Jonathan said, his voice smooth, though there was a slight tremor in it. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought we had worked through this. We can talk about this privately. I don't want to air our dirty laundry in front of anyone." Charlotte stood tall, her heart racing but her resolve unshakable. She had been silent for too long. It was time to confront him, not just as his wife, but as a woman who had been lied to, manipulated, and betrayed for far too long. "No, Jonathan," Charlotte said, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everything you've been hiding, everything you've been doing in the dark while pretending to be the man of God that people trust. It's time for the truth to come out." Jonathan's eyes flickered with something akin to fear, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Charlotte, you're overreacting. I'm still the man you married. You know this isn't me. These lies, they're just attempts to destroy me, to destroy us." But Charlotte wasn't fooled. The lies, the manipulation, the power he wielded, Jonathan had woven a web of deceit so intricate that he himself had begun to believe his own lies. She glanced over at Detective Harris, who stood by the door with a stoic expression, arms crossed. Charlotte knew this was the moment when Jonathan's empire would come crumbling down. "I know everything," Charlotte said, her voice now unwavering. "I know about the affairs. I know about the men you've manipulated. I know how you've used your position to control people, to make them do what you want. But what I didn't know, what I never imagined, is that you could go this far. You've been using your power to hurt people, to destroy their lives, all while hiding behind a facade of faith and righteousness." Jonathan's expression shifted, and for the first time, a flicker of panic crossed his face. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. The perfect pastor, the confident man who had led his church for so many years, was now speechless, trapped in a corner with nowhere to hide. "You're not the man you claim to be, Jonathan," Charlotte continued. "You're a predator. You've preyed on people's trust, on their vulnerabilities, and you've ruined lives in the process. And now you're going to pay for it." Jonathan stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. His hands clenched into fists, and for a split second, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then he stopped. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of the truth was beginning to suffocate him. "Charlotte, you don't understand," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. "I did this for us, for our family. I've worked so hard to build this life. You think it was easy, keeping up appearances, keeping the church together? Do you have any idea the pressure I've been under? I had to do what I did to stay in control, to make sure we didn't lose everything." "Lose everything?" Charlotte asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "What did you really have, Jonathan? A marriage built on lies. A family that didn't know who you truly were? You've lost everything now, because it's over. The truth is out, and no matter how much you try to hide, the world will know who you really are." Jonathan's expression darkened. The once charming smile was gone, replaced by something cold and menacing. For the first time, Charlotte saw the full extent of his true nature. He was no longer just a man caught in a web of lies. He was a man driven by desperation, willing to do whatever it took to protect his secrets. "You think you can expose me?" Jonathan said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can bring me down? You have no idea what I'm capable of. You don't understand, Charlotte. I built everything. You can't just take it all away. You don't get to decide what happens next." But Charlotte wasn't afraid. She had already made her decision. She had already taken back control of her life. And she knew that no matter how much Jonathan tried to intimidate her, no matter how many threats he made, the truth was already out there. The world would know what kind of man Jonathan Edwards truly was. "I don't want anything from you anymore, Jonathan," Charlotte said. "But the people you've hurt, the ones you've destroyed, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve justice." Jonathan's eyes flickered with rage, but it was clear that the battle had already been lost. There was no turning back now. His perfect world was falling apart, and all the lies and manipulation in the world couldn't save him. Detective Harris stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Jonathan Edwards, you're under arrest for the manipulation, exploitation, and abuse of your congregation, as well as the assault of your wife. Your actions have caught up with you." Jonathan's face twisted in disbelief, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation fully settled in. He had spent years hiding behind his reputation, but now there was no place to run, no way to keep the truth from coming to light. The walls he had built around himself had come crashing down, and there was no escape. As Detective Harris placed the handcuffs on Jonathan, Charlotte felt a sense of finality, as if the weight of the past was being lifted from her shoulders. She had fought for the truth, and now, justice would take its course. Jonathan Edwards was arrested in the same church office where he had once delivered his sermons, where he had commanded the respect of his congregation, and where he had built his empire on lies. The once powerful and charismatic pastor was now a shell of the man he had presented to the world. As Detective Lisa Harris led him out of the office in handcuffs, his eyes were vacant, staring ahead, as if in disbelief that it had all come to this. The facade that had shielded him for so long had finally cracked, revealing the dark truth beneath. The news spread quickly, and the community of Riverton was rocked to its core. Jonathan's arrest sent shockwaves through the church, his supporters, and even his family. For years, Jonathan had been the face of righteousness, the man everyone turned to in times of crisis, the man who held the keys to their salvation. And yet, in an instant, everything changed. The scandal that followed was catastrophic, not just for Jonathan, but for those who had unknowingly placed their trust in him. For Charlotte, the weeks after Jonathan's arrest were filled with mixed emotions. On the one hand, there was a sense of relief, a sense that the man who had destroyed so many lives, including hers, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But that relief was tempered by the realization that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The aftermath of Jonathan's actions would continue to reverberate through her life, her family, and her community for a long time to come. Charlotte had made the decision to speak out. She wanted the truth to be known, not just for her own peace of mind, but for the victims who had suffered in silence for so long. She worked with Detective Harris to help bring the full extent of Jonathan's crimes to light. The investigation revealed a horrifying pattern of manipulation and abuse, particularly targeting vulnerable members of the church, young men seeking solace, struggling with their own demons, only to be preyed upon by Jonathan's warped sense of control. It became clear that Jonathan had used his position as a pastor not just to preach, but to control, to isolate, and to abuse. The legal proceedings against Jonathan were long and drawn out, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The journals Charlotte had uncovered, the testimonies of victims who had come forward, and the overwhelming evidence of Jonathan's repeated use of his position to exploit others all painted a picture of a man consumed by power and self-interest. He had crossed lines that no man of faith should ever have dared to cross. And yet, in the end, he believed that he could talk his way out of anything, that his charm, his reputation, and his status would shield him from the consequences of his actions. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. Jonathan, once the proud pastor of St. Matthew's, now sat in a courtroom seat, a prisoner, his pride and arrogance replaced by something else, something darker. He no longer had the luxury of hiding behind his pulpit, no longer had the power to manipulate those around him. This time, He was facing the very people he had once led. The victims, those who had come forward, those who had been betrayed by the man they trusted most, were now seeking justice. Charlotte watched from the back of the courtroom as Jonathan stood before the judge. Her heart was heavy with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disgust. She couldn't understand how the man she had loved for so long, the father of her children, the man she had trusted above all others, had become the monster sitting before her. But as the trial wore on, she knew that what had been done could never be undone. There was no way to reverse the damage Jonathan had caused, no way to erase the years of manipulation, betrayal, and destruction. The testimonies from Jonathan's victims were heartbreaking. Each one painted a picture of a man who had preyed on their vulnerability, using his power and influence to manipulate them into doing things they never would have done otherwise. The stories were haunting, each one more disturbing than the last. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, Jonathan refused to accept responsibility. He continued to deny everything, claiming that he had been misunderstood, that the accusations were false, and that he was the victim of a smear campaign. But the truth was undeniable. The truth had a weight of its own, and no amount of denial could erase the damage that had been done. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for hours before reaching a verdict. Jonathan Edwards, the man who had once been a revered leader in the community, was found guilty on all charges. His conviction was a moment of justice for Charlotte and for all those whose lives had been shattered by his manipulation and betrayal. The sentencing was swift. Jonathan was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, a sentence that many saw as both justified and long overdue. For Charlotte, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but the scars left by Jonathan's actions would never fully heal. The years of emotional abuse, the lies, the deceit, they were now part of her story, part of the legacy she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But as Charlotte stood outside the courthouse after the trial, surrounded by the press, the weight of it all finally started to lift. The man who had controlled her life for so long was gone. The truth had been exposed, and the world knew who Jonathan Edwards truly was. The relief was palpable, but it was also a turning point. Charlotte knew that her journey was far from over. She still had a family to rebuild, a life to reclaim, and a future to chart on her own terms. In the days and weeks that followed, Charlotte focused on healing. She worked tirelessly to rebuild her relationship with her children, to help them process the trauma of discovering the truth about their father. Her son, Alex, was deeply affected by the revelations, struggling to reconcile the man he had idolized with the monster he now knew him to be. But Charlotte was there for him, as a mother, as a guide, and as someone who understood the pain he was going through. For Charlotte, the road to healing was long and difficult, but she was determined to walk it. She knew that the truth had set her free, not just from Jonathan, but from the lies and the fear that had kept her captive for so long. And as she looked ahead, she knew that her strength, her resilience, and her desire for justice would guide her through whatever came next. As Jonathan Edwards faces his reckoning, the truth about his manipulation and betrayal comes to light, and justice is served. But for Charlotte, the journey is just beginning. The scars left by her husband's deceit will take time to heal, but she has reclaimed her life. Do you think Jonathan's sentence was fair? How do you think Charlotte will move forward from here? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Was justice served in this case? What do you think it means for victims of manipulation to finally reclaim their truth? Subscribe for more gripping, true crime stories.